The summer of 1942. The Führer's headquarters in East Prussia. A man whose decisions would determine the fates of millions leaned over a massive oak table. Adolf Hitler studied maps of the Eastern Front, his gaze wandering between 2 points, Stalingrad and the Caucasus. In these July days, he made a decision that would go down in history as one of the greatest strategic blunders of World War II. Operation Blau was supposed to be a triumph of German arms, but the dictator's ambitions would turn it into a catastrophe. Instead of concentrating forces on a single objective, the Führer chose a path that would lead to the dispersal of armies between 2 directions. This choice would be the beginning of the end for the German war machine in the East. The oil of the Caucasus and the symbolic significance of the city on the Volga overshadowed military logic. December 1941 brought bitter disappointment to Germany. The Blitzkrieg, which was supposed to culminate in a triumphant parade in Moscow, choked in the snows outside the walls of the Soviet capital. Tank wedges that had cut through half of Europe froze in the Russian frosts. Wehrmacht soldiers, who had recently considered themselves invincible, were now retreating under the blows of the Red Army. The myth of German invincibility crumbled, along with the plans for a lightning war. By the spring of 1942, the situation on the Eastern Front had changed dramatically. Germany found itself drawn into a protracted war of attrition, for which it was prepared neither economically nor psychologically. Wehrmacht losses during the first months of the war exceeded all the most pessimistic forecasts. More than 800,000 soldiers and officers were killed, wounded, or missing in action. Tank divisions lost up to 70% of their equipment. The Luftwaffe lost air superiority over a significant part of the front. But most importantly, the tempo of the offensive, which formed the basis of German military doctrine, was lost. The General Staff of the Army found itself needing to revise its entire strategy. Franz Halder, Chief of the General Staff, understood. Previous methods no longer worked. The Soviet Union not only withstood, but also demonstrated the ability to resist effectively. The Red Army learned to fight directly during hostilities, becoming an increasingly formidable opponent with each passing month. The USSR's industry, evacuated beyond the Urals, gained momentum, supplying the front with more and more modern weaponry. The choice of the southern direction for the new campaign was due to several factors. Firstly, economic considerations. Germany desperately needed oil to continue the war. Secondly, strategic ones. The capture of the Caucasus could open the way to the Middle East and the Suez Canal. Thirdly, psychological ones. It was necessary to restore the prestige of German arms after the Moscow defeat. The southern regions of the USSR seemed more vulnerable to attack. On April 4, 1942, a tense atmosphere reigned at the Führer's headquarters. Hitler gathered the highest military leadership to discuss plans for the summer campaign. On the table lay a document that would determine the fate of millions. Directive number 41, codenamed Blau. This order would become the starting point for one of the most ambitious, and at the same time, fatal operations in the history of the Wehrmacht. The Führer was convinced that the new offensive should correct the mistakes of the previous year and bring a long-awaited victory in the East. The generals carefully studied the maps, understanding the magnitude of the tasks set. The initial concept of the operation looked logical and consistent. The main blow was planned to be delivered by Army Group South, in the direction of the Don and Volga. The goal was clearly defined: to capture the oil regions of the Caucasus, depriving the Soviet Union of vital fuel. Stalingrad was considered an intermediate objective, important for covering the northern flank of the advancing troops. The city on the Volga was to become a stronghold, ensuring the security of the main forces moving towards the Caucasian fields. The directive provided for a phased implementation of tasks. First, it was necessary to break through the Soviet defenses and reach the Don. Then, force the river and develop the offensive in two directions. The northern group was to capture Stalingrad and consolidate on the Volga, creating a strong barrier against possible Soviet counterattacks from the north. The southern group was tasked with breaking through Rostov to the foothills of the Caucasus and further to the oil fields of Grozny and Baku. The plan seemed realistic, given the available forces and means. The German command had significant reserves, transferred from other sectors of the front. The best tank and motorized divisions, air formations, and artillery units were involved in the operation. Germany's allies, Romania, Italy, and Hungary, also allocated their troops to participate in the offensive. However, even at the time of signing the directive, the plans contained serious miscalculations. The German command overestimated its own capabilities and underestimated the Red Army's ability to resist. The distances in southern Russia turned out to be much greater than expected, and Soviet troops demonstrated increased skill and tenacity in defense. Hitler's ambitions were already beginning to introduce dangerous adjustments to military plans, which would soon lead to fatal consequences. The black gold of the Caucasus lured Hitler like a magnet. In his feverish imagination, the oil derricks of Baku were already pumping precious fuel for German tanks and airplanes. The Führer was obsessed with the idea of the Reich's energy independence, and Caucasian oil seemed to him the key to ultimate victory. The staff's economic calculations looked tempting. The capture of the Baku fields could increase German fuel reserves several-fold. But behind the numbers on paper lay the harsh reality of mountains, deserts, and thousands of kilometers of hostile territory. The Soviet Union received about 70% of its oil precisely from the Caucasian region. The Grozny and Baku fields were working at full capacity, supplying the Red Army with fuel for tanks, aviation, and transport. The loss of these fields could paralyze the entire Soviet war machine. German analysts calculated that without Caucasian oil, the USSR would not be able to continue the war for more than a few months. These calculations seemed convincing in Berlin offices, but they did not take into account the Soviet industry's ability to adapt and the help of the Allies. Hitler saw the Caucasian operation not just as a military campaign, but as an economic revolution. The capture of oil fields was supposed to solve Germany's chronic fuel problem. The Romanian fields in Ploiești no longer covered the growing needs of the Wehrmacht, and synthetic fuel required enormous resources and time. Baku oil seemed like a ready-made solution to all the Reich's energy problems. The Führer drew grandiose plans for pipelines that would flow across the Black Sea directly to German ports. However, reality turned out to be much more complex than rosy dreams. The distance from the front line to the Baku fields was over 1,000 kilometers through mountainous and desert terrain. Soviet troops were not simply going to give up their oil wealth. The Caucasian mountains represented a natural fortress with a limited number of passes. The local population, contrary to German intelligence calculations, did not everywhere meet the invaders as liberators. Logistical problems seemed solvable to the German command. It was planned to quickly restore oil production and establish fuel transportation to the front line. German engineers were already preparing special equipment for repairing damaged wells and oil refineries. Special technical battalions were created, which were supposed to launch the captured fields as soon as possible. But these plans were based on the assumption of a quick and easy capture of the oil regions, which turned out to be a fatal illusion. July 1942 became a turning point in the fate of Stalingrad. What was initially planned as an auxiliary operation gradually transformed into the Führer's obsession. The city on the Volga bore the name of Hitler's chief enemy, Joseph Stalin, and this circumstance increasingly influenced the German dictator's decisions. Military logic gave way to personal ambitions and symbolic considerations. On staff maps, Stalingrad was still designated as an intermediate objective, but in Hitler's mind, it was already becoming something more. Every mention of this city evoked a special reaction from the Führer. Generals noticed how his facial expression changed when Stalingrad was brought up. Gradually, the city on the Volga began to overshadow even Caucasian oil in the priorities of the high command. The psychological impact of Stalin's name on Hitler was immense. The capture of the city bearing the name of the Soviet leader seemed to the Führer not just a military victory, but a personal triumph over a sworn enemy. The propaganda effect of Stalingrad's fall seemed invaluable for boosting the morale of German troops and the population of the Reich. Hitler already envisioned newspaper headlines proclaiming the fall of Stalin's city. The initial plan for the operation envisioned a swift capture of Stalingrad by Paulus's Sixth Army. The city was supposed to fall within a few weeks, after which the main forces would be redeployed to support the Caucasian direction. But already during the planning, Hitler began to make adjustments, increasing the significance of the Stalingrad operation. Each meeting at the Führer's headquarters brought new demands to strengthen the group advancing on the Volga. Generals tried to remind him of the original objectives of the operation, but the voice of military logic grew fainter. The symbolic significance of Stalingrad grew every day, turning a rational military plan into an emotional adventure. The city on the Volga became not just a geographical point on a map, but the embodiment of the confrontation between two dictators, two ideologies, two empires. July 23, 1942, will forever enter history as the day of the Third Reich's greatest strategic error. In the suffocating atmosphere of the headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler hunched over the maps, his finger nervously moving between Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The decision had been brewing for several days, but it was at this moment that the Führer finally settled on a fateful choice. Instead of concentrating all forces on a single objective, he decided to divide Army Group South into two independent formations. Directive number 45 landed on the general's table like a death sentence for the entire Operation Blau. Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff of the Army, understood with horror the consequences of this decision. The fundamental principle of military art, the concentration of forces at the decisive point, was grossly violated by the dictator's whim. Now the German armies were to advance in diverging directions, moving further away from each other with each kilometer covered. Army Group A, under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm List, was tasked with seizing the Caucasus and its oil riches. It included the 17th and 1st Panzer Armies, a powerful strike force capable of breaking through any defense. But the path to the Baku oil fields lay through mountain passes and deserts, where tank wedges lost their advantages. Army Group B, led by General Maximilian von Weichs, was directed towards Stalingrad. The main role in the assault on the city on the Volga was to be played by the 6th Army of General Friedrich Paulus, an elite formation that had covered the path from the Polish border to Kharkov. Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army reinforced this grouping, but its mobile units were doomed to get bogged down in street fighting in the industrial center. The distance between the two army groups was hundreds of kilometers, and with each day of the offensive, this gap increased. Neither could count on the support of its neighbor at a critical moment. The Soviet command quickly understood the benefits of such a division of German forces and began planning strikes against the enemy's stretched flanks. Hitler, meanwhile, reveled in the grandeur of his plans, not noticing how military logic was giving way to ambitious fantasies. He already saw himself as master of Caucasian oil and conqueror of Stalin's city simultaneously. The reality of war would cruelly dispel these illusions. But for now, Directive number 45 launched the mechanism of a strategic catastrophe, the consequences of which would be felt in just a few months. The 28th of July, 1942, marked the birth of a new military machine. In the headquarters of Army Group South, feverish activity reigned. Officers sorted documents, reallocated units, and drew up new supply schemes. Field Marshal Wilhelm List assumed command of Army Group A. gaining control of over 300,000 elite soldiers. Ewald von Kleist's 1st Panzer Army and Richard Ruoff's 17th Army were to be the hammer that would smash Soviet defenses on the way to the Caucasian oil fields. List studied the maps of the upcoming offensive with growing anxiety. The experienced commander understood the scale of the task better than the armchair strategists in Berlin. From Rostov to Baku lay over 1,000 kilometers of mountainous and steppe terrain, where every pass could become a fortress and every river an insurmountable obstacle. Soviet troops in the Caucasus had a good knowledge of the terrain and could use natural fortifications for stubborn defense. The first days of August brought Army Group A dizzying successes. Kleist's tank wedges broke through Soviet defenses south of Rostov and rushed towards the foothills of the Caucasus. The Red Army, weakened by previous battles, could not organize a solid line of resistance. German motorized columns advanced along steppe roads at speeds of up to 50 kilometers a day, capturing one settlement after another. The Soviet command ordered troops to retreat, avoiding encirclement and preserving manpower for mountain defense. On August 6th, Armavir fell, and on the 11th, Maikop with its oil fields. German soldiers saw real oil derricks for the first time, but the joy was short-lived. Soviet sappers carried out exemplary work to destroy equipment. Wells were blown up, pipelines destroyed, and oil refineries turned into smoking ruins. German technical specialists estimated that restoring the Maikop fields would require at least a year of intensive work. But the real trials awaited Army Group A ahead. As they advanced south, German communications stretched like a rubber band. The single railway could not cope with the needs of the advancing troops for fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Motor transport worked at its limits, but the steppe roads quickly deteriorated under the weight of military equipment. Soviet partisans began active operations in the rear of the German troops, blowing up bridges and attacking transport convoys. By the end of August, the pace of the offensive had noticeably slowed, and List increasingly received reports from his subordinates about shortages of fuel and spare parts. August 23, 1942. The headquarters of the 6th Army in the Don Steppes buzzed with activity. Colonel General Friedrich Paulus bent over a map of Stalingrad, studying every street of the city that would soon become his curse. The elite army, which had traveled from Warsaw to Kharkov, received a new task: to capture the industrial giant on the Volga. Paulus was confident of success. His troops numbered over 270,000 men, thousands of guns, and hundreds of tanks. The experience of the Blitzkrieg inspired optimism. Cities fell in days, weeks at most. Stalingrad seemed like another step on the path to victory. Gustav von Wietersheim's 14th Panzer Corps and Wilhelm von Langermann's 24th Panzer Corps were to break through the defenses and burst into the city blocks. Infantry divisions were tasked with clearing the captured areas and securing positions on the banks of the Volga. The plan looked flawless on paper, but the reality of Stalingrad would prove to be completely different. Soviet intelligence carefully monitored the movements of German troops. Joseph Stalin personally oversaw the preparations for the defense of the city bearing his name. Vasily Chuikov's 62nd Army took up positions in the city, turning every building into a fortress. Workers from Stalingrad factories were not evacuated, but took up arms, preparing to defend their hometown to the last bullet. On August 23, a massive bombing of Stalingrad began. The Luftwaffe dropped over 1,000 tons of bombs on the city, turning residential areas into a sea of fire and smoke. German pilots reported the complete destruction of the city's infrastructure. It seemed that after such a blow, resistance would be broken. But the ruins of Stalingrad would become an even more formidable fortress than intact buildings. The first tanks of the 6th Army broke into the city's suburbs on August 29th. Paulus expected a quick breakthrough to the center, but encountered fierce resistance on every street. Soviet soldiers turned rubble into firing points, basements into shelters, and sewer tunnels into routes for stealthy maneuver. German tank crews, accustomed to open spaces, got lost in the labyrinth of ruined quarters. The 21st of August 1942 brought German alpinists a triumph that would turn into a bitter irony of history. On the snow-capped peak of Elbrus, the highest point of the Caucasus, a swastika flag fluttered. Soldiers of the Edelweiss Mountain Rifle Division posed for photographs against the backdrop of endless mountain ranges, unaware that their feat would become a symbol of the entire operation's failure. 5,642 meters above sea level, it was at this altitude that German troops reached their southernmost point of advance. But from the peak of Elbrus to the Baku oil fields, there were still 500 kilometers of hostile territory. Photographs from the snow-capped peak flew to Berlin, where the Reich's propaganda machine was already preparing sensational stories about the conquest of the Caucasus. Goebbels personally supervised the preparation of materials about the German alpinists, who hoisted the banner of the Third Reich on the roof of Europe. German newspapers were full of headlines about the Wehrmacht's triumphant march across the mountain peaks. But behind the beautiful shots lay the harsh reality of a fading offensive. Army Group A was bogged down in the foothills of the Caucasus, stretching its communications for hundreds of kilometers. Kleist's tank divisions, which had recently rapidly broken through the steppe expanses, now crawled along mountain roads at the speed of a pedestrian. Every pass turned into a fortress, every gorge into a natural trap. Soviet troops skillfully used the advantages of the mountainous terrain, luring the enemy into ambushes and inflicting painful blows on extended columns. The oil fields of Grozny beckoned German generals, but the fortress city in the foothills proved to be a tough nut to crack. Soviet defenses relied on powerful fortifications and natural obstacles. Every attack by German troops was broken by well-organized resistance. The fuel that was supposed to flow like a river into German tanks remained an unattainable dream. Field Marshal List reported with growing alarm to the Führer's headquarters about the slowdown in the pace of the offensive. His troops controlled mountain passes and high-altitude pastures, but the strategic objectives of the operation remained unattainable. The Baku fields seemed as distant as they had at the beginning of August. Army supply became a nightmare for quartermaster services. Every ton of ammunition, every tank of fuel reached the front line with huge losses of time and resources. September 1942 brought an atmosphere of increasing tension to German headquarters. Field Marshal Wilhelm List increasingly received queries from the Führer's headquarters about the pace of advancement towards the Baku oil fields. Hitler demanded explanations as to why his troops were stalled in the foothills of the Caucasus instead of pumping precious oil. The experienced military leader tried to convey the reality of mountain warfare to the high command, but his reports were met with an increasingly cold reception. Every day of delay intensified the dictator's anger, who saw in the general's slowness a sabotage of his brilliant plans. List understood the absurdity of the situation. He was accused of indecisiveness, even though Army Group A had advanced hundreds of kilometers through the most difficult terrain. Soviet troops offered fierce resistance at every turn, turning each gorge into a battlefield. Army supply became a logistical nightmare. Fuel and ammunition took weeks to reach the front lines along broken mountain roads. Partisan detachments constantly attacked transport convoys, and Soviet aviation inflicted painful blows on communications. On September 7th, the fateful conversation between List and Hitler took place. The Field Marshal tried to explain to the Führer the objective difficulties of the Caucasian operation, but the dictator perceived this as excuses for failures. Hitler accused his general of pessimism and a lack of offensive spirit. List bitterly understood that his military career was coming to an end. The Führer did not forgive those who dared to contradict his strategic designs. On September 9th, the order for his dismissal arrived. List relinquished command and departed for Germany, carrying with him the bitter understanding of the futility of the entire Caucasian adventure. Hitler made an unprecedented decision to personally lead Army Group A. The dictator, who had never commanded large formations in battle, decided to show the generals how to fight. This decision shocked the entire general staff. It was technically impossible to manage an army group from headquarters in East Prussia. The distance of 1,500 kilometers turned any order into an anachronism by the time it was received. Franz Halder openly expressed dissatisfaction with this decision, which further intensified the conflict between the Führer and the professional military. October 1942 transformed Stalingrad into an apocalyptic landscape of smoke, dust, and blood. Paulus's Sixth Army became mired in endless street battles, where every house became a fortress and every floor a battlefield. German soldiers, who only recently considered themselves masters of Europe, now fought for every meter of the ruined city. Tank wedges, which had cut through France's defenses in weeks, were stuck in a labyrinth of factory buildings and residential quarters. The advantages of the Blitzkrieg evaporated in the smoke of burning ruins. Soviet soldiers turned Stalingrad into a giant fortress where death lurked around every corner. Snipers set ambushes in the ruins of buildings. Machine gunners fired from basements, and sappers mined every passage. German officers realized with horror the city was devouring their divisions like an insatiable monster. Each day brought new losses, but the front line moved only a few meters. The Red October factory, the tractor plant, the metallurgical complex. These industrial giants became symbols of a new type of war. Battles of unprecedented ferocity unfolded among machines and blast furnaces. Workers did not leave their workshops but took up automatic rifles, defending their native walls. Production lines turned into firing positions, and factory chimneys into observation posts. Paulus demanded reinforcements from Berlin, but each new division dissolved in the Stalingrad meat grinder. Elite Wehrmacht units lost their morale in endless attacks on the same ruins. The city on the Volga absorbed German reserves intended for other sectors of the front. Hitler stubbornly demanded the assault continue, unwilling to acknowledge the failure of his ambitious plans. Each day of delay strengthened Soviet defenses and weakened the offensive capabilities of the German troops. November 19, 1942. A frosty morning in the Don steppes. Fog spreads over the snow-covered fields, concealing a grandiose picture from German observers. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers are taking up their initial positions for an operation that will turn the tide of the entire war. Operation Uranus. This was the name given by the General Staff of the Red Army to the plan for a colossal counteroffensive near Stalingrad. Months of painstaking preparation, covert troop transfers, and ammunition accumulation were drawing to a close. The Soviet command patiently waited for the moment when German forces would finally get bogged down in urban battles, having squandered reserves and morale. This moment had arrived. Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky developed an encirclement plan that was destined to become a classic example of military art. The blow was planned to be struck against the weakest sections of the German defense, the positions of Germany's Romanian and Italian allies. These troops were inferior to the Wehrmacht in armament, training, and morale. Soviet intelligence carefully studied the disposition of enemy units and identified the most vulnerable points in the front line. The Romanian Third Army north of Stalingrad and the Fourth Romanian Army south of the city were to become the first victims of the Soviet offensive. At 7:30 in the morning, thousands of guns roared. Artillery preparation of such power had no equal in the entire history of the Eastern Front. Shells burst in the Romanian trenches, sweeping away wire obstacles and turning positions into a lunar landscape. Germany's allies could not withstand this firestorm. Within an hour of the shelling's start, Romanian units began to retreat, abandoning heavy weapons and equipment. Soviet tank corps rushed into the created breaches, developing the success with unprecedented speed. The 26th Tank Corps of Alexei Rodin and the 4th Tank Corps of Andrei Kravchenko broke through the defense north of Stalingrad and rushed southeast, enveloping Paulus's 6th Army in a wide semicircle. South of the city, units of the Stalingrad front advanced, which were to close the encirclement ring. The German command was caught off guard by the scale and swiftness of the Soviet offensive. Paulus received the first alarming reports of the breakthrough of Romanian positions, but did not yet understand the grandeur of the enemy's design. Confusion reigned in his headquarters. The main forces of the army were tied up in battles in Stalingrad and could not be quickly redeployed to repel flanking attacks. The fatal strategy of dividing forces, adopted by Hitler in July, now turned into a catastrophe. Army Group A, bogged down in the Caucasus Mountains, could not help the Stalingrad grouping. Reserves were scattered between two distant directions. Soviet troops methodically used this miscalculation, striking precisely where the enemy could not concentrate sufficient forces for a rebuff. November 23, 1942, became a day of triumph for Soviet military art. At 16 hours 30 minutes, the vanguard units of the 4th Mechanized Corps met with the tank crews of the 26th Corps in the area of the Soviet farmstead. The encirclement ring closed. More than 270,000 soldiers and officers of Paulus's 6th Army found themselves in a gigantic cauldron between the Don and the Volga. Dreams of a swift capture of Stalingrad turned into a nightmare for the German command. Friedrich Paulus received news of the encirclement with disbelief. Just yesterday, his army controlled most of the city, and today it was cut off from the rest of the world. Communication with the Army Group headquarters was disrupted with every passing hour. Soviet troops methodically tightened the ring, cutting off the last supply routes for the encircled grouping. German fuel and ammunition depots remained behind the front line, and winter cold turned every day into a test of survival. Hitler categorically forbade attempts to break out of the encirclement. The Führer demanded that positions be held at all costs, promising to relieve the army from the outside. But Army Group A was hundreds of kilometers from Stalingrad, bogged down in the Caucasian foothills. Reserves for organizing a rescue operation had to be gathered from all over the Eastern Front, weakening other sectors. The fateful decision to divide forces between the Caucasus and Stalingrad now doomed both groupings to defeat. The Soviet counteroffensive presented the German command with a dilemma: to save Paulus's army or to hold the Caucasian positions. Only one could be chosen, but Hitler stubbornly clung to both goals simultaneously. Every day of delay strengthened Soviet positions and weakened the Wehrmacht's capabilities. Baku oil became an increasingly fleeting dream, and the Stalingrad cauldron turned into a grave for elite German divisions. When the dust of battles settled over the Don steppes, it became clear. Operation Blau had turned into a textbook of strategic errors. The German command made miscalculations that forever changed the course of World War II. Analyzing the events of the summer and autumn of 1942, military historians identify three fundamental errors that doomed the German offensive. The first and most obvious is a gross violation of the principle of concentration of forces. Dividing Army Group South into two independent directions contradicted all canons of military art. Clausewitz taught that victory goes to him who concentrates maximum forces at the decisive point. Hitler, however, dispersed his armies between the Caucasus and Stalingrad, depriving each group of the opportunity to achieve decisive superiority over the enemy. If all forces had been thrown at one objective, the outcome could have been different. The second fatal error was a catastrophic overestimation of their own capabilities. The German command planned the operation based on the experience of the 1941 Blitzkrieg. But the Red Army of 42 was radically different from the troops that met the Wehrmacht at the border. Soviet generals had learned to fight. Industry had established mass production of modern weapons, and soldiers had gained confidence in their strength. The Germans, however, continued to think in terms of easy victories, not taking into account the qualitative changes in the enemy. The third error was a consequence of the first two, a monstrous underestimation of the Soviet potential for resistance. Planning to seize territories from the Don to Baku, German strategists did not take into account either the geographical scale or the determination of the defenders. Every kilometer of advance required ever greater efforts, stretching communications and exhausting the offensive impulse. An alternative scenario of events could have been completely different. By concentrating all forces in the Caucasian direction, the Germans had a chance to reach the Grozny oil fields before winter. The capture of the main oil fields could indeed have paralyzed the Soviet war machine. But the ambitions of the Führer, who craved both oil and a symbolic victory over the city of Stalin, doomed the operation to failure. History knows no subjunctive mood, but the lessons of Blau remain relevant for military strategists of all time. February 1943, the last defenders of Stalingrad lay down their arms in the snow-covered ruins of the city. Field Marshal Paulus signs the act of surrender, concluding one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Operation Blau, conceived as a triumph of German arms, definitively turned into a strategic catastrophe. But the true significance of this failure extends far beyond the specific military events. The Battle of Stalingrad became a turning point not only of World War II, but of all 20th century world history. The initiative finally passed to the Red Army, which would never again relinquish it. Germany lost its capacity for large-scale offensive operations and shifted to strategic defense. The psychological effect of the defeat at Stalingrad shook not only the Wehrmacht, but all of Nazi Germany. The myth of the invincibility of the German soldier collapsed in the Don steppes. The lessons of Operation Blau are studied in military academies worldwide as a classic example of how the ambitions and incompetence of the supreme leadership can ruin even the most perfect military machine. Modern strategists find many parallels between the events of 1942 and 21st century conflicts. The principles of force concentration, realistic planning, and accounting for enemy capabilities remain relevant regardless of era and technology. Dividing efforts among multiple objectives still leads to defeat, and overestimating one's own capabilities leads to catastrophe. Operation Blau forever changed the balance of power in the world, paving the way for the victory of the anti-Hitler coalition and the formation of the post-war world order.